Hello everyone and welcome to week 3. Sorry about this dorky headset. I'm trying to make sure that the audio actually works, unlike the second Descartes video for last week, so hopefully this helps and isn't too distracting. So for this week, week 3, what you have to read is you have to read an excerpt by Descartes, the correspondence between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth, and one reading by Amo, which is going to be also about Descartes' interactionism. So all of these readings, to some extent, are a deeper dive into the nature of Descartes' theory of the mind. And so, just as a brief refresher, we're going to talk about 3 different perspectives that Descartes says that we can have on ourselves, and also like why this would be a kind of satisfying picture of the world. And so the order that we're going to be discussing the text is we're going to talk about the Descartes that was assigned first because it was very short, and allows us to clarify the nature of the Cogito argument. Then we're going to talk about the correspondence with Princess Elizabeth, and then we're going to talk about the Amo. Okay, so to begin with, the Descartes that we read, this comes from the Objections and Replies section of the Meditation. So when Descartes published the Meditations in 1641, it also contained selected objections and replies that came from a number of important philosophers during the period, and this really helped sort of introduce Cartesianism as a point of view to the philosophical audience of the 17th century. And so one of the points that Descartes makes, it's actually really interesting in that reading, which is why I excerpted it and had you read it online, even though it's not included in our textbook, is the claim that the Cogito argument is not a syllogism. So for those of you who are newer to philosophy, maybe not familiar with this kind of argument, so the way that a syllogism functions is a syllogism is a chain of reasoning where you have 2 premises and a conclusion. And so the most typical example that philosophers will use, they'll say something like, okay, first premise, and this is a universal premise. All men are mortal. It's universal because it uses the quantifier all. So all men are mortal. Then it has a particular premise. In this case, it would be Socrates is a man. And then finally, the conclusion of the syllogism is Socrates is mortal. So the basic idea here is that you try to develop a chain of reasoning. This is sort of the logical infrastructure that was important to this period. It was originally developed in Aristotle. So of course the scholastic philosophers really liked it, really thought it was quite important. A lot of what happens in early modern philosophy are developments in logic that otherwise hadn't really taken place since Aristotle. And so that's what a syllogism is. A syllogism is an argument that contains 2 premises, a universal premise and a particular premise, and arrives at a conclusion in that way. And so it's a form of inferential reasoning. Because I know that these premises are true, I can know with certainty that the conclusion that I've established at this point follows from those premises. So what Descartes clarifies is that the Cogito argument is not a syllogism. And so in other words, the way that the Cogito argument works is the Cogito argument does not first establish for anything that can doubt, it must be thinking, and then particular premise, I have the possibility of doubting. So conclusion, I must be a thinking thing. Now, this might be one coherent way to try to interpret the Cogito argument. I think that Descartes actually reformulates the Cogito argument later to be more similar to this form. And the basic idea is just that, like, hey, if I am a being that has the capacity to to doubt, then that implies the capacity to think. And so you can just arrive to the fact that I'm a thinking thing just from the fact that I have the possibility of doubting things. And that seems like a pretty good model for the Cogito argument as we discussed it previously. Now, the reason why Descartes is not particularly satisfied with this formulation of the Cogito argument is because on this construal, the Cogito is not an immediate form of knowledge. And here the immediacy is a really important point. Descartes' point is that the Cogito, to know that you're a thinking thing, is a form of immediate self-awareness that's different from the sort of awareness that you get from an inference, from inferential reasoning. So Descartes' argument isn't really that you know this metaphysical postulate that would be the first premise of the syllogism, that anything that can doubt is thinking. And then you do the particular premise, which is like, hey, I'm that sort of thing. I have the capacity to doubt. So, conclusion, I must be a thinking thing. No. What Descartes is saying actually is that you have a form of immediate self-awareness about your own thinking, actions, and judgment that is in no way reducible to something that you can know purely by inference. And this is very important because without this immediate kind of knowledge, it's not clear how the mediated kinds of knowledge that we ordinarily have are possible. And so this is sort of a clarification of the Cogito argument that I think is really interesting for thinking about Descartes' philosophy of mind. I think that the crucial takeaway is really just that for Descartes, what's essential to the Cogito is that you have an immediate kind of self-awareness that's not based on anything else, where you know yourself in virtue of being the thing that you know, in virtue of being a thinking thing. You have an immediate kind of self-awareness, self-relation. It's not disturbed by physical objects in the outside world. Okay, so before we get into Princess Elizabeth and Amo, who are both going to problematize Descartes' picture in some way, let's maybe think a little bit more about why this way of thinking substance dualism. It's called substance dualism because it's the claim that there are two fundamentally different kinds of substances. There's the mind and there are bodies. The mind is a thinking thing. It's not extended. It's not something that you can know in virtue of things in the world, external bodies, anything like that. Whereas bodies are extended things that you know via perception and you know via your senses, and you can do all sorts of reasoning and the experimental sciences, all that kind of stuff. So one reason why this might be really satisfying as a picture is because it seems to preserve the important insights from scientific investigation while also preserving important dimensions of our own self-awareness and our own rationality and life that doesn't seem to be accountable by the natural sciences. So in this case, bodies, extended things that take up space, those are the sort of things that can be investigated by the natural sciences. And so Descartes is really giving pride of place to a lot of the natural sciences in that respect. While the mind, on the other hand, is something that's not extended. And so even though there are the natural sciences, and those natural sciences can investigate the body, like our body, akin to a physical body in space. And so we can talk about like how, if I slam my hand down on the desk, the physical interaction between the desk and my hand, and like it's going to leave a bruise and all of that kind of stuff. And so Descartes wants to be able to preserve the ability of scientific insights to really be able to tell us insightful things about our relationship to the world, but also to be able to preserve a place for our own thinking and judgment, the realm of our soul, the way that we are thinking thing, the dimension of our existence that outlives our bodies, and the relationship that we can have to God, which is that we can know God through a purely rational approach towards the world. And so, of course, we often do have to consider ourselves both as a thinking and an extended thing. And this happens whenever we talk about voluntary actions, like would you go over to the other room? Here I'm making appeal to the fact that the person I'm speaking to is a thinking thing, like I'm making an appeal to their judgment, I'm asking them to do something, I'm not just like pushing them over there, right? But I'm also treating them as a physical thing, as a body, as occupying a distinct location in space that is different from other objects. And so that is an important dimension to my understanding of other people. And so for Descartes, the point is that we have these three different perspectives on ourselves. We can treat ourselves as a purely rational thing. We can treat ourselves like a purely embodied thing that interacts with other bodies. Or we can treat ourselves as a thinking thing that is embodied in a certain particular location with a body and so on. And so Descartes wants to say, okay, well, I've discovered the three relevant perspectives through which we can analyze our own action, in which we can understand different substances in the world. And so that's basically what a good philosophical account is supposed to do. And so now we're going to talk about Princess Elizabeth and Amo, who are both going to really show some cracks in the armor, to show some ways in which this picture is maybe still not quite adequate for an account of our own knowledge and reasoning.